because of their availability in the market. But it should be noted that these are our expected values, that depending on which scenario does end up falling out, there's as much deviation in this year 10 demand as 14,000 units, and in this year 13 as much deviation as 17,000 units. And so there's some pretty significant numbers, but fortunately we're going to be able to look at that again in November when a lot of the scenarios have been decided and make up any shortfalls that we see by additional orders in November. So the order we're going to place in July is going to be for a large amount of units. You can see there about 55,000 total. That's going to strain our current warehouse capacity. If we change nothing else about our inventory model or about our warehouse capacity, we're going to need to somehow find about 71% more capacity in our warehousing system. But as you can see on this slide, we're noticing that there's as many as 88 days of inventory in the system. And so we're going to take a look at that. We're also going to talk with our suppliers and see if we can negotiate a little bit better delivery schedule than having the whole lot dumped on our doorstep in one day. We're going to look at maybe a staggered delivery of receiving so many units every couple weeks so that they will fit within our existing warehouse capacity and we won't have to incur the additional expense of expanding that. This order is going to take up about $32 million in working capital. It's going to tie that up for about 6 months. But the expected savings we're going to get from the 20% discount on SEER 10 units and the incentives to customers on the SEER 13 units are going to save us around in the neighborhood of $12 million. And so once we discount that, we're looking at around a $10 million total savings today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who's going to talk about the supply chain issues.
We have a plan on meeting customer demand for Q1. We also want to make recommendations on how to improve the supply chain for the future. What we have now is 16 distribution centers located throughout the United States. These distribution centers are all acting independently to carry inventory and fulfill demand. We think that there's room for improvement. The first step is to group these 16 distribution centers into 4 more centralized regions. One distribution center from each region will be nominated to be a supply depot, in addition to its regular activities. Now, the distribution centers that remain will have their stock reduced from what we think is around 13 weeks of inventory down to a target level of 2 weeks of inventory. The supply depots will have their inventory levels adjusted in order to be able to meet unexpected surges in demand at the distribution centers. We've done some analysis on the benefits this might bring. In column 2, you can see what we think the current inventory is, about 120,000 units in the system. The proposed inventory is listed in column 3. At the distribution centers, it is put down to 2 weeks of inventory, and at the supply depots in yellow, it's adjusted at a baseline level certain to meet surges in demand. The new inventory level is about 36,000 units. If the average unit costs about $1,000, we anticipate nearly $84 million in savings from inventory purchasing costs. This doesn't count associated holding and handling costs that goes along with holding that much inventory. Stage 2 of our long-term strategy involves turning the distribution centers into transit points. The transit points will hold no inventory. They will merely be a meeting point to help smooth the logistics of getting inventory out to the customers. Here's how this will work. Customers will call the supply depot. The supply depot guarantees next day delivery of units to the transit points. Transit points, when the inventory gets to the transit points, it can either be loaded onto a contracted delivery truck who makes milk runs to the customers, or the customers can have the option of picking up the units in their own truck and receive a slight discount. An additional option with this strategy is that the supply depot can send out full truckloads to individual customers who have larger orders. In addition to inventory benefits, we think this strategy will also help us to grow sales. Right now, we know who our customers are. They are dealers who resell the stock to builders and contractors. We think that having a next day guaranteed policy will help them. When they are assured of delivery the next day, they can expand their sales without having to hold additional inventory and take on additional costs at their own locations. This will allow all of our customers to compete on a level playing field and ultimately help us to grow our sales. We've looked at some of the potential gains from this transit point strategy. As you can see in column 3, the transit points don't hold any inventory. It's all held at the supply depot. This lets us further cut the inventory to around 22,000 units, and if each unit has a cost of $1,000, we immediately save about $90 million in inventory purchasing costs, as well as holding, handling costs, as well as warehousing costs. What this doesn't capture is gains that can be made by improved customer service. We think this can really help us capture market share and improve sales for the future. Now I'm going to hand it back to Brett for some talk about risks and contingencies.
Thanks. Well, we've talked a little bit about the supply chain and our plans for July and November, but we still have an area of some pretty decent uncertainty in our system, and that's the real possibility that Holder is not going to be able to deliver the units we order in July on time. And so we have 3 things that we're going to do in November if we look at that situation and find that they really are going to have a delay for us. First, we're going to look at the current inventory we have in the system. We've discussed how much inventory we believe in the system and how we believe it's fairly excessive. We think this may be an opportunity to clear out some of that inventory as part of our restructuring plan. We're also going to look to start a virtual warehouse system between our distributors so that they know where the inventory in the system is and that we can reallocate it to where it's needed most if we do need to move it. Finally, if when we look at these 2 things, if we really still don't believe we're going to be able to meet demand here, we will, if we absolutely have to, make an order from Bream in November. And we don't really want to because they cost a lot more and we don't believe their product is as good as the Holder product. But if that's what we have to do to make the demand, then that's what we'll do. So to sum up, we kind of have 2 areas of strategy. The first is in our short-term strategy, and that's to meet the customer demands in Q1 of 2006 and to do it in a way that maximizes our profit. And second, in the long term, we want to switch to 16 warehouses and 4 supply depots, from 16 warehouses to 4 supply depots. Yes, that's it for my time. Thanks, and we'd be happy to take your questions.
Question for you. Great analysis work that you guys have done. How do you expect we're going to get our rather entrepreneurial divisional managers to buy into this? I mean, there's a big change for them. What's going to make them want to be a part of this?
We do recognize that they have been operating autonomously for quite some time, and the company actually takes a lot of pride in having this, so it's going to go against their nature to move towards a more centralized system. We're going to accomplish this in a couple ways. First, while we develop the system, we're really going to get their feedback and get their participation in this. This kind of gives ownership back to them in this process. Secondly, we're going to make sure that it's clear that incentives in the future are tied to overall profitability. When they start seeing the gains that are made by reducing inventory and improving customer service, they're going to see more compensation and incentives, and we think this will really get them on board with this new strategy.
If I understand right, the dealers are going to, across the board, get next day delivery from orders. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was there an analysis done to see what the cost benefit would be to go right from the manufacturer to the dealer rather than have all the overhead of all these distribution centers and buffering so many, so many pieces? I mean, it seems if it's next day delivery, it could come right off the line for the biggest part of the product and go right to the dealer. Was there an analysis done to look at that to reduce the overhead? I know you centralized some of the points, but to add next day delivery too, was there an analysis done to look at that?
In terms of looking at streamlining everything so that it's straight from Holder or Bream's factory to the customer, we could not perform an analysis that looked at that. What we wanted to do was find out really the most efficient way to take the system that we had and make it as profitable as possible for us in a way that we can believe that we can roll that out and make it happen. We have some idea of what the overhead costs will be, but really not enough to build an analysis for the purposes of this case to look at that. But if given more time and more resources, that would certainly be something we'd like to do.
Now, I might have missed this, but you're talking about substantially reducing your inventory. Substantially. I mean, like almost more percentage than I've ever seen. Help me follow through and explain to me how you got to that point again. I mean, you're talking about reducing from 16 to 4 in a phased approach, taking your inventory from 120,000 down to one scenario, $27,000, $20-some thousand units?
Yes. To make this happen is going to take a lot more than just saying that it's going to be so. It's going to take a lot of work upstream and downstream to get everyone on board with this. It's going to take quite a bit of coordinating agreements with our suppliers to make sure that we can get the orders that we need at the supply depots, and then good coordination to be able to move those overnight to each of our transit points and ultimately to the customer. So it is quite a bit of work, but we're pretty confident it can be done given good communication is with everyone in the distribution channel, as well as good communication between our supply depots and centers. We mentioned a virtual warehouse earlier. That's another way to help us kind of pool variance and allow us to hold less inventory in the system while still meeting these unexpected demands that are occurring at each location.
You allow me to allow it. From a quantitative perspective, we can also base this kind of approach. The fact that if we look at the production cycle time, we think, based on the case study, it could be around 1 month and 2 months. So basically, if you are going to have certain level of inventory, okay, at least, we know that it's at least 1 or 2 months. So if we try to go down because of pulling all the variants that we have in the system into those warehouses, it's not that illogical to think that we can go to that level, 2 weeks. Obviously, the idea will be that in the process of going down, we will be monitoring all the process and determine, okay, this is the minimum point that we can get. But we have to aim, for a high goal in order to be able, to reach something that, may be lower. But it's not completely out of, it's logical from the perspective of the production cycle time than the two providers that we are dealing with have. So that's the reason why we decided to go for such a low number. Thank you so much.
Okay, while Pete's queuing up the next presentation, the third team is from the University of Illinois.
I think they started using it.
Okay.
Hi. Welcome. Hi. Hey. How are you?
It works.
It pointer works?
Yeah,
Okay.
it does.
Just try this pointer. If it doesn't work, I'll give you another one.
Oh, we're not going to be using the pointer anyway, so no problems. Members of the Board of Warmco, we'd like to thank you again for inviting us here to talk to you about some of the opportunities that are facing you in the air conditioning market and how you can utilize some of the new regulations to your benefit. My name is Cody Boyd. I have with me Kapil Rajukar, I have Zavar Halaji, and Sumit Mittal. To go with our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about the executive summary, our recommendations, followed by the supply-demand model, cost analysis, our marketing strategy, some risk hedging, and then, of course, the implementation plan. As you rightly know, better than we do as the consulting team here, Your position in the market is very close competitors with Watsco. You are the market leader in 6 states, which allows you some freedom to exercise some clout in those states, which we will get to as far as how we can utilize some of those as well later on our recommendations. In the industry, the 13 SEER regulation is happening, and there really is no way to get around that. Consumers will have to switch eventually. And as some of the research that we've done shows, the consumer themselves will also have to incur the costs of this new regulation. And so the question is how to go about that. We believe that with our recommendations that you should establish a corporate vision to become a leader in the marketplace. And with this, we believe that you should immediately enter the 2010 compatible 13 SEER market. Now, along with that, we believe that the entire value chain should be paid attention to as well, so that you can manage some of the risks and costs from the suppliers all the way down to the consumers and concentrate on the whole value chain. Now, these are very large recommendations, and how do you quantify them? How do you make them more specific? We've come up with specific areas of immediate actions as well as long-term strategies for you to implement as well. First, our immediate actions to establish a relationship with a supplier, and that particular supplier being Holder Inc. Holder Inc. is one of the ones that are taking the risk upon themselves to change to the 13 SEER market, and we believe that they will be a leader in that market by changing so early. To build new relationships with alternative suppliers so that you are not wholly dependent upon Holder Inc., so that you have some other options available to you. To raise some required capital for entrance into the new market by short-term financing as well as longer-term financing, which we will get to in our presentation. Our long-term strategy deals primarily with lobbying for government and utility companies, having the correct pricing and marketing structures through promotion as well, reducing inventory levels through optimization, through other products such as i2 or Wanomi Incorporated, as well as to emphasize on aftermarket sales. The $8 billion market for air conditioning, 70% of that market is aftermarket sales and service. And so we feel that that would be an important area to not ignore. Now, where we see Warmco currently is combined with some of the other competitors. The competitors that exist, there's 26 in the marketplace, are all generally right in the middle between efficiency and price. They're really not too high efficient, they're not too pricey, and so they're kind of in this middle ground, which tends to be a little bit difficult to get in a competitive advantage when you're with all these other competitors. We believe that there is a place for Warmco to move from the other competitors to a more efficient, higher SEER rating, as well as give you some price flexibility. Currently in the marketplace, there's a little bit of price inflexibility, and you'll be able to establish yourself as a leader on the cutting edge of this market by the compliance to regulations as well as future compliance to future regulations, which continue to happen. Now, Kapil is going to talk about the supply and demand model and how that relates to where we see Warmco going.
Thanks, Cody. So as Cody mentioned, during the course of our presentation, we'll give you specific steps to achieve the strategy, the overall strategy that we recommend. And because this is a very supply chain intensive industry, let's start with the supply chain model. So here we have tried to attempt to find out, do an analysis on the supply chain model that currently exists. And there are 3 things that we would like to point out as far as risks are concerned. Number 1, unreliable supplier base. As far as we know, Holder Inc. is the only manufacturer who has committed to 13 SEER manufacturing. Number 2, demand variability. We don't know how customers are going to respond to this particular regulation. And number 3, interaction of different entities within the supply chain. Let's start with the demand side. Again, as I said, the demand is variable. We don't know how the customer is going to react. But given the model that you had provided in the case, we looked at the different scenarios. And the scenarios that specifically we looked at is 1, whether the utility companies are going to give us any incentives or the users any incentives. Are the customers going to consider the fact that in 2010, the new regulation is going to take into effect? So looking at this, the dynamic model that is presented over here, and there's 3 scenarios, scenario 1, 2, and 3, the probability of scenario 2 is 50%. Again, this has been taken from the poll that you took with your managers. So we considered, while building our demand model, the scenario number 2. Now again, these numbers won't make much sense unless we compare them with the supply side. So let's look at the supply numbers. Again, this model, we have assumed several things to come up with this model. Number that I would like to you to focus on is that as you look from 2006 to 2010, the demand is greater than supply. And I think this is intuitive because we know currently that there's only one manufacturer who is focusing on manufacturing 13 SEER. But as we move on towards 2010, the supply is trying to match with demand. And again, this demand and supply is for 13 SEER, our demand, and Holder Incorporation's supply. The key takeaway from this slide is that we are looking at 50% of Holder Incorporation's capacity to match our demand. And that's one point that we would like to emphasize you on again when we look at the risks. The risk is losing Holder Incorporation in the long term. And the things that we want you to focus on is, one, the immediate step is to build a long-term relationship with Holder Incorporation. We don't want you to wait till November to make a decision. We want you to go ahead right now and build a relationship with Holder Incorporation to capture the capacity. But to hedge the risk of just having one supplier, we want you to diversify your supplier base. So when we looked at the various suppliers that are available currently in the market who can supply this, there's one key thing that we looked at. Are these suppliers following the technology curve, or are they leading the technology?